Hi everyone, welcome back. What we're doing in this second week is now that we've learned a little bit about the fundamentals of economics, we're going to start trying to understand the macroeconomy as a whole. And so to understand the macroeconomy as a whole, it's helpful to understand the difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics. Macro, as some of you may know, comes from the Greek for large. The field of macroeconomics studies large-scale economic issues. We're no longer dealing with the single economic actors that we might have seen last week where Dean Garrett is buying coffee or President Wu is hiring workers, but instead we're dealing with aggregates like countries. This means we're looking at the total output in an economy, the total employment in an economy, and aggregate prices, which is some sort of price index that covers most products in the economy. So when I say in the economy, it might be useful here to think about the US economy. So when we're looking at the US economy, we might see something in the news that says, for instance, the US economy's growth slowed to 2.1% in the second quarter. And this is a really interesting question because it's not quite clear what that means. What is an economy overall, and what does it mean for its growth to slow? And sort of more importantly than that is this welfare question. How does that affect us as individuals, and how important is that for society? So to get there, we need to understand some of these major concepts in macro, which again looks at the economic activity of large actors and aggregates, so mostly countries. And understanding these concepts will help us to better understand economic argument, which we're looking in this class, help us to better understand the news and what's going on in the world today, and also help us to better look introspectively and make our own personal decisions and make our own financial decisions. So today we're going to be covering GDP, which is gross domestic product, and most of what we'll spend today doing is just defining what this term is. And then tomorrow we'll be looking at economic growth, the cost of living, and unemployment. And putting these two lectures together, this concept of gross domestic product and how the economies grow and how much it costs to live and unemployment, we'll begin to look at a larger picture of what macro looks like overall. So the goals for today's lecture really just center around this one concept, GDP. Not just how we define it, but within that definition, what goes into it and what doesn't go into it. So what's included and excluded. And once we get this definition, this what is GDP, what's in it, what's not in it, we can also ask why it's important. In asking why it's important, we can also ask why it might not be important. What are the shortcomings of it? One such shortcoming might be how might inflation affect these data, and within this framework of worrying about this one economic concept, GDP, we can also approach it from a computational standpoint. We can think about it formulaically, we can think about it as an account. So what is this concept? How do we compute it? Why might that computation be important? Why might it be unimportant? So let's start just by looking at the words in it. Gross, meaning all, aggregate, the total amount of everything produced in an economy. Domestic is in the economy, and product is production. And we're actually going to go deeper on this definition. I know this seems straightforward, but we're really going to do a deep dive into this definition because it ends up being a very powerful definition. And what GDP is, like I said, is the aggregate or total amount of everything produced in an economy, which gives us a number that we can use to measure or analyze the health of an economy. And what this is a very basic tool, a very basic definition, and it allows us to analyze economic health. So loosely speaking, more production means more income, means better outcomes for all of us. And this allows us to compare productions across time in the same country. So is US production going up or down? And it also allows us to compare across areas. So what does US production look like compared to, say, Chinese production? And increases in GDP are generally assumed to be good, healthy, and positive, and decreases suggest that something is wrong with the economy. But it's a little more nuanced than that because typically GDP is always rising, and instead we look at what the growth rate in GDP might look like. And this is actually a question for tomorrow's lecture. But what's implicit in this, this definition is that production is the same as income. So one country with a very productive few people might match the GDP of a more equitable or a more just nation. So if production is the same as income, take a minute to think about yourself what that suggests. And then what we're going to do on top of that, look at the uses of GDP data. Because if production is the same as income, it implies that we can use GDP data, but it also implies that we might abuse or misuse GDP data. And to see how that might be the case, it's helpful to look at the three main reasons we use GDP data. And think back to that headline I showed you a few slides ago. What does it mean when the US economy's growth is slowing? Well, it might mean that living standards are falling, not only from last year to this year, but maybe from our country relative to Germany. Similarly, we can measure economic growth, and we'll talk next lecture what this means. And we can also talk about the short-run ups and downs in economic activity, and that's sort of beyond the scope of CORE180, but loosely speaking, we can think of whether or not we are in a boom or bust cycle, whether or not we're in a recession. Let's talk about that first bullet point, estimating can be used to measure living standards. And this is a good place to end this first little mini lecture video. So let's do a quick pause and think amongst ourselves what GDP can be used for if it's a measure of national income, how this might influence living standards. And while you're thinking about this, also think where it might not come into play.